Welcome to this video about internal family systems and working with the IFS model. So I'm Natasha Nambujihawan. I am a level 1 IFS practitioner in the UK, and I'm really excited to bring you this wisdom, knowledge and practice. So IFS is an evidence-based psychotherapy brought over to the UK by Dick Schwartz and his team at the Institute for Self-Leadership. Now, this model is very, very unique because it places the self or soul energy right at the heart of any work that we do. It recognizes that self or soul is the driving, stable factor in our world, in our system, that has the capacity to lead and guide and ultimately help the different parts within our system to release the burdens that they're carrying. So what's really also beautiful about this process is that it's led not by the therapist, but by the client. And the therapist is trained to guide the client into a journey of exploration where they meet themselves where they're at. The processes are completely aligned to meeting that person exactly where they're at. There aren't any psychoanalytical aspects of the model. We don't, as practitioners, spend any time working anything out. We are simply guiding the client to anchor into their own self-energy and to create that dialogue with their internal world from the seat of that self-energy. And so as we navigate the internal world and we meet different parts of our system, different parts of our mind, of our ego, we encounter those parts and meet them exactly where they're at. We don't push any parts of us into territories that our system might not be ready for. So it's a completely safeguarded and held process. It's incredibly safe, and that's why I absolutely love working with this model. So I work as a pure IFS practitioner, and I also fuse IFS techniques within coaching. I've been a coach. It is my longest standing modality. I've been a coach for 10 years, over 10 years. And I absolutely infuse the IFS model into the coaching work that I do because it is so effective. It's the most effective way at getting to the heart of the matter and being able to support that person to really develop a completely different level of self-awareness that also then puts them in the driving seat of releasing what's there, releasing those burdens. So I'm going to break this model down for you so that you really understand it, and then I'm going to flag up some really important signs when working with people so that you know and you understand perhaps where they are in that, let's say, the journey of what is possible when we're engaging with our internal world. So let's begin. So first of all, I want to share with you this diagram. So we're going to talk through the diagram. I'm also going to find a way of sharing this digitally with you. Okay, so we have on this diagram the self. The self is in the center. We place ourselves, our soul self energy in the center. Now, the characteristics of the self are inherently neutral, compassionate, kind, and non-judgmental. So characteristics of the self that we can easily recognize are kindness, curiosity, creativity, courage, playfulness, clarity, compassion, as I've already mentioned. These are the central characteristics that we tend to find that when we're really embodied in our self-energy, we're using these aspects of our beingness. And I want to say something about self-energy. We're not necessarily like, I'm really in self-energy now, and then the next moment I'm really out of self-energy. We can use that sort of way to describe how self-energy works. But what I also want to say is that self-energy is always present. we are always in our self energy. Self or soul is really what we are. And the parts of our mind, our body, they're all expressions of soul. So self or soul is always present, is always here, is the guiding factor, is that which expresses this mind and this body. So so when we say I'm out of self energy or when I'm in self energy, it's not necessarily completely 100% reflection of what's actually happening. So for this diagram, we're going to place self in the middle. Now, the other component of our internal world are our parts. Now, our parts are divided into 3 different categories here, okay? And when we talk about our parts, we're talking about the ego. And we recognize that the ego isn't just one energy. It's not just one personality. That the ego is actually consists of many different parts in our internal world, many different energies, shall we say, personalities, masks even. You know how sometimes a situation comes up and you have a part of you that's really excited about it, like a party is happening, a part of you is like, I'm really excited, I really want to go, I'm really going to see people that I haven't seen in a while and I want to let my hair down. But then another part of you is kind of not excited, is sort of triggered about it and is worried about who's going to be there and, oh, but I've stopped drinking and there's going to be alcohol, and is worried about that. Though that's a demonstration of how we can have different, often polarized or even conflicting parts within our system. And these parts of us are a part of us. They have their own belief systems, their own ways of being, their own behaviors, their own ways of managing certain situations. It's as if we have lots of different people, personalities living in this internal system. So actually, when we talk about people with multiple personality disorder, hello, we all have multiple personalities. It's just that some people find it really challenging to cope with, or have different ways of coping with all of those different personalities. So the parts of us are inherently protective. All of our parts are inherently protective. And actually, I realize that that's not on here, and it's so important. I'm going to actually put this at the top. In some way or form, all of the parts in our system are protecting us. Fundamentally, they're protecting us from any harm. They're protecting us from any trauma happening to us. And they're protecting us from venturing into situations where we may be triggered. Because ultimately, there's a remembrance of an adverse experience that we had, an unpleasant experience or a traumatic experience. The memory of this very much sits within the psyche, very much sits within the body. And parts of us actually can hold these memories and hold the burdens of these memories. And we call those the exiled parts. So when something happens to us and we are we face a trauma or an adverse experience, something that shouldn't have happened to us, that destabilize our system, this can be what a trauma can be, then often a part of us, one of those personalities of us that was really impacted by that, retreats into the system and becomes exiled. It goes and hides away. We call those exiled parts. The traumatized parts of us that are carrying the burdens of the trauma are called the exiles. And what we find is that other parts in our system, which we can call the managers, they kind of come in to take control. Something has happened and the managers come in and they form these layers of protection around the exiles. So the managers are parts of us. They're very organized. They analyze a lot. They can also judge, because their role to judge and to criticize is ultimately to help protect us, to discern what situations might be dangerous or unsafe so that we don't go there, etc. The managers keep control, can be manipulative. They can be survival mode. They can also be very creative, problem solve, nurture, and be very helpful. And often the managers are also they'll minimize the situation to make it seem less intense, as a way of managing us, as a way of managing our psychological response, managing our physiological responses so that we can regulate again. And remember, these managers, their role is for us to survive, to keep us away from our old wounds, to keep us away from situations that may put us in a vulnerable situation or may create a new trauma. And then finally, we have what are called firefighters over here on the right. And the firefighters are all the parts are really incredible in our system, but these are the ones that come in really, really quickly, and they help to soothe the situation. They help to take us away from the situation. So if something's happening and we're triggered instantly in that moment, often firefighters will be activated also to do something, so they can often distract us. So many of us, myself included, often I get busy. It's my busybody thing comes out, and I just kind of distract myself by being busy. Firefighters can also include other kinds of distractions and other things that take us away from being present with ourselves and facing up to what's happening. And this can be substances, alcohol, it can be social media, it can be types of drugs that are very intoxicating and really take us away. Firefighters can also contain situations, can be often reactive, and can have impulsive or compulsive behaviors as also a way of getting some kind of stability or routine into a situation to stabilize what's happening. Firefighters can also be rebellious, let's leave this all behind and just break the rules and go mad. And busybodies, as we've said. So this is a breakdown of the types of parts, the different categories that the parts in our mind-body complex can play. And they all self-organize into a system without our input from us being children and having experienced different experiences, maybe some adverse experiences and also really positive experiences in our life. Our parts just went ahead and organized themselves to protect us and to help us progress and persevere and survive in the world. Now, what actually happens when this starts to, some trigger comes in, a situation happens or a trigger comes in? How do the parts of us actually react? So let's break that down. So I have a situation here that's written in red at the top, an example of a situation, which is that we get an appraisal from our boss or from a manager or whomever. So I'm going to use this to describe how these different parts in our system can react. And hopefully this will resonate with something within you, where you can then start to really feel the texture of this, and you can relate this to your own internal world or your own internal system. Perhaps an example for yourself will arise. So in this situation, we go for an appraisal with our boss, and maybe our boss isn't so conscious in the way that they're communicating, and they're just kind of projecting things out onto us. Maybe they're under pressure and there were targets that they had and they're making it about us. So maybe the feedback that we're getting doesn't feel completely fair, or maybe the feedback we're getting, is quite intense. So what can often happen is that we get triggered. So we feel in our body often before anything happens. And what we're feeling in our body is the memory of that old wound. So ultimately what's happening is an old wound is being triggered, a remembrance of something that happened to us in the past, that this is triggering that old wound, is opening up that old wound because it has the texture of that. And why it's triggering that is fundamentally because we formed fundamental beliefs when that old wound happened. So say, for example, when I was 6 and I went to primary school and I did something and my teacher told me off. Or my friend did something and I took the rap for it and my teacher told me off, or whatever it was that happened. And at that time, when I was being told off, it felt so unfair, it felt so destabilizing that I took on burdens as a result of that experience back in that past. maybe shame. Maybe I felt ashamed because of what I did. Or maybe I felt that I wasn't good enough or what I did was wrong. And so that energy of that reaction of how I felt or how I was made to feel, and being made to feel, again, isn't truly completely accurate. We are all co-creating in this situation. So it was partly the teacher projecting at me, and it was partly myself taking that on. So as a result of that, I carried those energies of I'm not good enough, I did something wrong, and shame in my body and my mind, and my body and mind complex. And that sat within me because I didn't know at the time how to release it, how to deal with it. I probably went home and didn't tell anyone, and that sat and became lodged in my mind-body complex. So years later, when I'm in this situation, what happens is this old wound is triggered. And that remembrance, and it might not even come to me like, oh yeah, this is related to that thing that happened when I was 6. It's just the feeling in the body, that uncomfortable feeling, because those old wounds, those burdens are still there. And maybe later on when you go home and you reflect, you start to feel that shame, you see it, you experience that old shame, that I'm not good enough, and that starts to come up. And you may not even still remember where it comes from, but you might start to become more aware of what this uncomfortable energy is that's sitting within our field. So ultimately, that's sitting with the exile. The exile is triggered, okay? So when the exile is triggered, because it's like getting into danger zone now, because it was so bad back then, the rest of the parts in the system recognize that we're getting into this sort of almost alert danger mode. And so the manager parts come and they kick in, and the firefight parts come and they kick in. They come and spring into action to help manage the situation. So the manager may come in here to bring back control, and also to maybe project judgment onto another, because that's a way of just managing the situation. So the manager might help us to think that, well, it was their own fault. You're projecting blame onto somebody else, to helping us to shift that blame or shift whatever is happening by just projecting and finding other people in our team to blame. Oh, well, such and such didn't do this, and then they put me in a bad situation, and that story that we create. And then also maybe anger comes up, and anger also can be seen as a firefighter. Sometimes it can really take us away, but as a means of managing that situation, that manager, maybe another manager comes in and gets angered and riled up, and it's a way of like, yeah, it's just, it brings an energy to try and transmute what's happening here, but ultimately the anger, it can't fully transmute because it's not releasing. Okay, so that's the way a manager can pop up. And then a firefighter can come up immediately reactive and say, right, let's go for a drink after work. I need a drink after work. And those drinks will just help to bring us into the gamma state, will help to kind of calm and soothe the brain chemistry and help us to relax, and even maybe take us away from that and take us, and it's able to distract us to speak about other things, and move away from this whole situation. So that's an example of how the internal system works together to react, to protect, ultimately, us from really going into the depths of our wounds, of our pain, of our suffering, from, remembering how challenging and difficult it was, but also from taking us to a situation. So sometimes there might be a situation that the internal world can see, right? If you go near that situation, it's going to trigger some old stuff. So our managers can keep us away from that, or even our exiles can come up and sort of be like really present, and we can be really aware of this tenderness and this vulnerability. And I think I put it on this side, but didn't really fully explain it. So the exiles, they really hold burdens. They hold the burdens of the trauma. So it's not really the trauma itself that's the issue. It's something that happened to us. That's the way the mind sees it. But ultimately, it's something that just is. It just is the way that it is. So that situation occurred, and then because at the time we didn't have the tools to be able to not take that on as trauma, or it was so intense, that then this part of us that took the brunt of all of that held on to those burdens and ultimately became distant and moved away from the central system as a means of being protected. The exiles are often stuck in time. So they're often stuck in a loop, in a trauma loop or a karma loop that's back in that time. And they really actually, when we go and meet these parts of us through internal family systems, through the model, through the therapy, through the process, we often find that these parts of us are very young. They are actually, they were impacted upon when we were very young, and subsequent experiences later on in our life are just triggering that original wound. And we find that they're stuck in time. Often they don't even know that we've grown up. Those parts of us are literally hiding away in some depths of our shadow, not knowing that years and years have passed and I'm now a 36-year-old woman, and this exile still thinks that we are 6 years old. And there's this vulnerability and this tenderness that can also be associated with the exile. So when we feel this real vulnerability and tenderness, or when we start to play out, we're like, oh, I'm getting this memory of when I was a child and I was standing in front of my classmates and I was being laughed at. When we start to get these memories, these explicit memories of these uncomfortable, traumatic situations, we know that our exiles are being triggered. We know that they're up and they're being triggered. And sometimes when our exiles are being triggered and we can remember those situations, or we feel that vulnerability and tender, it may be a sign that those exiles are ready to release their burden. And that's ultimately the process that we go through. We get to a point where the managers and the firefighters, we get them on board. They start to trust self as we have this dialogue with them. And they ultimately relax and they step aside so that they can reveal and allow us to get to the exile. And when we get to the exile through this therapeutic process, we work with the exile, not the therapist, but the client. We work with the client, and the client works with their own exile to release the burdens. So we're guiding the process. We're guiding the client to have an internal dialogue with their managers, with their firefighters, and with their exiles. We're guiding the client on what to say, what questions to ask, and what to reflect back to these different parts to build trust, to build that compassion, to build that relationship, to befriend our inner world, so that eventually the managers, they all step out the way, all these layers of protection step out of the way, and we get to the exile. And the exile, we give the exile what the exile needed all those years ago. We give that support that the exile needed back then. And sometimes it's just to be with it or hold it. Sometimes the exile really needs to speak and let the stuff out. And ultimately, at some point, the exile wants to release its burdens. And so soul energy works with the exile to unburden it. And then we call back in those amazing qualities that we once lost as a result of this situation. And the exile is then able to rejoin the system and become a really beautiful, useful part of the system again. It's like those parts of us, those inner children, those parts of us that we just lost, because ultimately, like, growing up, what's that about? Like, we are ultimately just children, and those playful parts of us are so important in our journey as human beings on this planet, to bring this curiosity, bring this zest for life, this yearning and longing to explore who and what we really are, and to tap into subtle energies and subtle realms. As children we can do, and as adults we very much lose, we miss out on. So just to kind of recap as well in a different way of what can happen when we're being triggered, because this is like the real life situation. So in IFS, in a session, what's really beautiful is it's an opportunity for us to work on parts of us that we know are really up. They are really activated or triggered or have been coming up quite a lot. So for example, I might have a client that comes to me and says, I'm getting a lot of anger coming up and I don't know where it's coming from, and I'm projecting it onto my children, so I really want to work with that. And what we can do is we facilitate a process as practitioners where we help that client to get in touch with that part of them that's angry and learn about that part and start to work with that part to find out what's underneath that, and then that angry part will reveal that actually it's angry because of something else that's underneath it, and eventually we get to that exile. And that exile that we meet is being protected by the anger and everything else. Actually the anger is there because of what happened to the exile in many ways. And then we work with that exile. So that's the way that we work in a client and situation, but we can also work internally with ourselves as well. We can utilize these tools minute by minute. It is the most beautiful. This is what's so amazing about IFS, is it's fantastic as a psychotherapeutic tool of psychotherapy, and it's fantastic as a day-to-day tool. So this is very much just like a natural way now that I think and that I am, and the way that I relate to others. So I tend now to speak not from my parts, but for my parts. So as I'm practicing day to day using the tools, I'm actually starting to develop more and more and more awareness of soul energy, and I'm anchoring more and more into soul self energy. So I speak from soul and I speak from soul. And what I do is I speak for my parts. So when I feel that anger arising, I speak for it. And I say, I can feel part of me is really angry about what I'm seeing right now. Or when I feel a sadness arising, I say, I'm really feeling this sadness coming up. And what I'm able to do is I'm able to differentiate that is a feeling and an energy and a feeling state and an energy within my system that's arising. That it is not me, and I don't need to jump in and blend and become overwhelmed and consumed by it. I've learned to create this almost sort of detachment from it, because from that place of detachment I can see it and I can have compassion and hold space for that sadness in my system, and then I can move forward and release it. So what's actually happening? So when our exile is triggered, often our firefighter and manager comes in and creates a behavior for us to soothe and be distracted from that exile. So it's like something we just feel in our body. We're watching something on TV, we're in a situation, we just suddenly go, and you might not even know what it is, but it's just there. It's like, I stopped in my tracks. So a manager will come up and will take us out of the situation, or will dissociate us. We'll just kind of almost dissociate. We'll just kind of zone out and go somewhere else and just not even really be here in the room right now. But when we come around from that dissociation, or when we wake up the next day with a hangover, or whatever it is that manager or firefighters had to do in order to take us away from that traumatic situation where we were exiled, our exiles, were triggered. When we wake up from that dissociation or the next day, then we can have parts that come up that feel kind of crap about it, that feel ashamed because we turned to alcohol, or to feel weird because we dissociated and we don't really remember, and maybe fear comes out, what happened, or maybe a part of us comes up that feels really lonely. So these other parts can then be triggered after the soothing dissociation. And when those parts come up, then another manager part can intervene to try and move us forward. So then we get busy. It's right, then my manager comes up, it's let's just get busy and let's just distract ourselves more. Let's get on social media today. Let's go. We've got a whole list of things to do anyway. And then what can happen is another part can come up that's a judge or a critic can come in and start to criticize what's going on. It's well, you're just, taking yourself away from the situation. You're just distracting yourself. And often when we're a little bit on the spiritual path of personal evolution, we have that part come up and why aren't you sitting with this? Why can't you see what's wrong? We have this part comes up and judges us, and that in turn then triggers another exile. That judgment triggers another part of us that is wounded from that. It's wounded from that judgment. It has a memory of that judgment from the past. And that goes back round to then triggering an exile. So we can be caught in this loop of anxiety. So for many of us, we are caught in this loop of anxiety, or in this loop of trigger or fear or paralysis. Once this starts to happen a lot, and we are like constantly on a day-to-day basis in doing this, and we're stressed on top of that, because all of this is like tied in with stress and worry and fear and work and money issues and all that kind of stuff, that creates all this pressure cook situation. And at some point we can really break down, and we can even become paralyzed. So there are different kind of responses. We have the paralysis response, which is the freeze response, or we have the fight or flight response, which is the need to run away from the situation and just need to do something to get out of this situation. And I'll talk more about that in another transmission, where we can dive into the autonomic nervous system more and the polyvagal nervous system, which work hand in hand. So the autonomic nervous system is the part of our nervous system that regulates our sympathetic nervous system and our parasympathetic nervous system. So our sympathetic nervous system is our rest and digest mode, and our parasympathetic nervous system is our fight or flight mode or freeze mode. And so, when we are calm and we are soothed and we're doing all of those things that help the vagus nerve to be really toned and for the heart space to be open, and our neurotransmitters to be really calm and soothed and all of those wonderful things, then we're in that rest and digest mode, and our body can digest food well. Blood is being pumped to all the different organs in the body. But when we are in a stress response and stress hormones are being pumped out as a way of regulating us, as a way of getting energy to the body, the parts of the body that needs it, we can go into this fight or flight response or the freeze response. But the problem is, it's a very old, primitive part of the nervous system that's activating to help us to run away from a saber-toothed tiger. But we don't have that situation, and often actually our threats are to do with the workplace, or to do with finance, to do with other things that are non-physical. And so there's a whole cascade that happens within our physical body because of the fact that we're not using the energy that's being made available to us as part of the parasympathetic nervous system activation. And we tend to store that energy that's been made available as fat. And then an inflammation happens, and a whole cascade happens onto the physical body. So there are real physiological impacts from being in rest and digest, and then being in the fight or flight or paralysis phase, which I'll go into later in more detail. So this cycle of trigger to firefighter behavior, to dissociation, to waking up and feeling shit, to manager part being triggered to intervene and move us forward and distract us, to then a judgment part coming in and criticizing, then coming back to that exile being triggered again. This cycle can perpetuate for lifetimes. So we have a real ability to come in here and to see that for what it is, and to work with the managers, to be able to create a dialogue with the managers, to find out more about how they're working and what makes them tick, in order to help those managers and help those judges and help those critics relax a little bit more into the system, so that we can bring in that wisdom from self and soul energy that it's okay to be triggered. It's okay for us to hit the bottle sometimes. It's okay for these feelings to be present. And in time, working from the self energy, working with the different parts in our system, we can build this trust and the energy, the abundance of energy and strength and resilience from the self energy can go and feed into the parts and feed into the firefighters to bring them into alignment with this way that we're perceiving, the way that we're as self are behaving. And so in time, those managers step aside, and we can get to the exile, and we can help the exile to release those own old wounds. And then this cycle, this loop, it ceases, because that original trigger is no longer there. We will notice one day, oh my gosh, I didn't get triggered. I didn't get triggered by my boss telling me that I didn't do that project very well, because I did that work to release those burdens of those exiles, and that exile is now part of the system. And my managers and firefighters, they can see the situation for what it is. They've learned to see the situation for what it is. They've learned to see it from self energy. And that exile is okay. It's cleared. It's cleared its burdens, and it no longer carries that memory. So it's like, fine, it's okay. See the situation for what it is. Now, we can also unburden our exiles through energy work, not just through the motions, the process of IFS. We can do that through energy work. So through the breath, through movement, through the evolutionary action of Kriya. There are so many different ways that this energy can come in and transmute and help to spontaneously unburden. This is happening all of the time, and we might not notice until something happens again and we're like, I didn't get triggered that time. And then we realize, there must be something that unburdened or something that cleared from my system. That means that memory is not there, that trigger isn't there. So energy work alongside doing the IFS is of utmost importance, and these two work so closely together. The actual process of unburdening in IFS is an energy technique. It's also aligned to the elements. So if you are working as a coach, you haven't trained as a therapist, an IFS therapist or an IFS practitioner, there are lots of ways that you can safely bring IFS into your coaching. As the primary objective of building awareness. So when we can support the client to be more empowered, so we're not empowering them, they are empowering themselves. And when we can support them to do that by helping them to build more awareness in their internal world, to help them connect the dots, then they can go away, feel empowered and do that work themselves, or go and seek out another practitioner. So as IFS is a trauma-informed modality, it's very much working alongside understanding how trauma works and how we can clear trauma from the body. IFS techniques are directly aligned to that. I wouldn't say necessarily that if you're working with IFS that you're a trauma therapist, okay? There are more and more layers of training that go on top of that to and experience also to be able to call yourself a trauma therapist or a trauma coach. If you're working more in a coaching capacity, then what we need to be aware of is when a client is in their trauma, when they're triggered by their trauma, or when they're so in it that their own well-being starts to really come into question. Either they're at harm at themselves, or they're at risk of harming themselves, they're at risk of harming other people, or they're in a situation where that trauma is so consuming for them, it's potentially leading them towards a psychosis or a breakdown, or a situation where they are going to feel very destabilized and even helpless. We as therapists, often energy work therapists, yoga teachers, and so forth, can see this happening, can see this coming sometimes because our clients present themselves in our therapy rooms, in our classes, and we can see the signs. So this is something that I'm going to be teaching in another transmission, how to spot the signs and symptoms of somebody who is in a trauma response or who is triggered. And when we see these signs, that's when we can act. So we can ask ourselves, is it safe for me to continue to work with this client in this setting right now? And is it appropriate for me to refer this client on to a therapist that can work with this client in this time? Those two questions. So I'll give you an example. When I'm doing energy work techniques, and sometimes clients come to me and they're lying down, or even before that in the consultation, they're telling me that, they've been having these memories of standing in front of the classroom and being laughed at. And they remember that it was so difficult. They're just getting these memories, and it's really been destabilizing them. They're crying maybe, and they're saying, I'd forgotten all about this, and now that I'm remembering, I'm just realizing how sad I feel about what happened in my childhood. And it's triggering other things that happened in my childhood, and they maybe share other memories about what happened in their childhood. On one hand, I can see that because the memories are there, their exile is saying to them in one respect that this is ready to be looked at. And on the other hand, they're in a response. So in that moment, I might honor the fact that they've come to me and make an assessment as to how stable I think that they are. And if I feel that they're stable and regulated and resourced enough, so they have the ability to be okay and to ride this journey out themselves, and also with my help, then I might say to them, okay, I might say to myself, okay, it feels like they're in their trauma is triggered. But I feel, I've asked myself that question, I feel that it's safe for me to work with them. They've come to me and I know that I can safely work with them because I can create boundaries around my work. I can be really in my own integrity with the kinds of tools that I'm using, and I can remember that I'm not here to release their trauma. I'm not a trauma therapist. I'm here to help them relax, to help them build those internal resources so that they can do this work themselves. So then I might say to them, okay, well, I think that this is what's going on, without alarming them, without analyzing. I can reflect that back to them. I can feel that you have this really deep, important stuff that's really up for you right now. It's really present and it's triggering other memories that you have of these really difficult situations. So what would you like me to do today for you? What would help you today? And again, you're putting it back onto them. So we're not taking that responsibility ourselves, like, oh my God, it's my responsibility, I need to clear their trauma. No. And I'm going to talk in another transmission about therapist parts, about our own parts that jump in, that feel like we need to fix or rescue, or like it's our job to do something. We need to keep things really clean, keep those boundaries, and cut any codependent ties. So we show up to them, we ask them, how do you want me to show up to you in this moment? And we be guided by them. So if simply what they, I just want my mind to have a rest, I just need to relax, then that's what we do. We don't go in with an agenda, right? Okay, I'm going to help them relax, but I know that this thing is there and I'm going to get to it. And no, we meet them where they're at, because the energy work, whatever energy work we do, whatever therapy we work with, is always going to show up. And the energy of that work that we do, even if we're doing energy work or not, it doesn't matter if you're not working with energy, there's still an energy behind the intention that you're bringing, and it will always come in for the highest and greatest good anyway and do what it needs to do. You may, without even like intending it, the energy that you're holding, the space that you're holding may be enough for that person to spontaneously unburden, even though you're just providing a relaxing experience for them. So we show up in the way that they want us to show up, because if we don't, and we're starting to poke and prod around, their system knows, and we're breaking a boundary of trust. Okay, so that's one example where we're seeing somebody in a trauma response, or we're seeing someone's trauma being triggered, or their exiles being triggered, and when we feel like we've asked ourselves that question and we feel like, yeah, no, I can safely work with this. But somebody might present in a different way, and you can see that they're really unraveling. They're very destabilized. They may have come to you, or they may be on the phone. And what you might do in that situation is decide and say, you know what, I think I can maybe help them by speaking to them and soothing them a little bit, but actually ultimately it's not really safe for me to go fully in right now, or I feel it wouldn't be effective anyway, and it's really appropriate at this time to refer this person on to a therapist that can work with them at another level or in another way. Or perhaps you feel like, I don't feel comfortable dealing with this, and so it's my duty of care to guide that person and lead them on to the next one. And so at that point we would refer. So it's really important for us to have those people within our field of consciousness, within our practice, linked in, that we are able to then refer people out to. Okay, so that's an introduction to how to work with IFS safely if you're working in other modalities. And I just want to stress that it's really important that you assess your own capacity to do this work, and at what stage it's important for you to refer that client on, way before that client gets into a territory where they're if possible, if you can anticipate way before that person is getting into a situation where they're breaking down, or they're incredibly destabilized, or they're in psychosis. In reality, that doesn't often happen. In reality, people leave things, and by the time they get to you, they're already in psychosis. They're already breaking down. And that doesn't mean you've done anything wrong. It just means that that's just where that person is at. And so we work with where they are at in that moment. So I hope that this has provided an overview of working with the internal family systems model and how to safely work with the internal family systems model in other holistic therapies. And I will go into that deeper in my other transmissions, as well as share some amazing wisdom and techniques to work with our own parts, particularly our therapist parts that are really activated when we are doing holistic work. Thank you so much for tuning in. Have a beautiful day, and I will connect with you soon.